Obesity is a national crisis. Our nation is getting fatter and fatter by the day, and there is no end in sight. The battle to figure out exactly why this is happening is ongoing. So far, there's at least 4 models that attempt to explain why our country is getting fatter every day, but none of them are considered settled science. Recently, a new model was put forth that may be the missing link in tying together each of these 4 approaches, and today we're going to dive deep, try to understand exactly why the obesity crisis has exploded and maybe what can we do about it. I am Jack Murphy, co-founder of Rebel Health Alliance and co-host here of our podcast with Dr. Deep. How you doing today, Dr. Deep?
Jack, I'm doing great. Thank you so much. Good to see you. Excited to dive into an interesting topic here today.
It really is. This report came out a little like maybe December or January of this year, and it was all over social media because obesity is definitely a hot topic of the day. It is a national crisis, an economic crisis, a national security threat, and we need to figure out exactly what's going on. It's amazing to me, Dr. Deep, how could something so profoundly affecting America be heretofore unexplained? What is that?
Well, Jack, I think this highlights the complexity of the human body and of the environment that we live in our modern day. And, to reduce anything down to one particular food group or one particular way of living, I think is a bit reductionist when we're talking about one of the most complex systems in the known universe.
It is complex indeed. And I think one of the things that always have attracted me to the study of nutrition or science or the exercise science of the body is that the science is not settled. There's always something new coming out, some new learning, some new study that explains things that we may have assumed but didn't know for sure. And the obesity situation is one where there are a bunch of competing models. And if you're online at all, you can see the leading acolytes for each one of these models sparring every single day, telling the other people that they're a bunch of idiots and saying my way is the only way. And you've got energy you've got, carbohydrate model, you've got some more scientific-y models we're going to talk about here today. And then you've got people complaining about the environment, environmental things. Maybe it's the water, maybe it's the food. Today, we're going to go through each of these 4 existing models, and then a 5th one coming from this report, Obesogens, a unifying theory for the global rise in obesity. Let's get started and dig right in. What has been the first and most prominent method to explain weight gain or obesity in people?
Well, Jack, I think the classic one that most folks think about is the calorie in, calorie out, right? That's where the Weight Watchers sort of started. That's the teaching that many of us discuss with our patients and talk about or learn about in medical school. That all comes down to the energy balance, and being in an energy deficit will lead to weight loss. Being in an energy surplus will lead to weight gain. While I do think that there's certainly truth to that, I think the story is much deeper than that. There's interesting studies and sort of thought experiments where, animals, for example, that are in captivity in zoos and they have very specific calorie intake, even when that's reduced lower than their basal metabolic rate, these animals still gain weight. If you take the thought experiment into humans, I've seen folks talk about, well, if I was in a calorie deficit versus the amount of energy I was expending for the day indefinitely for 20 years, wouldn't that mean I would wither down to literally nothing and I would just waste away? Why doesn't that happen? I think there are clearly examples of where unfortunately throughout human history and even in our modern day, people do wither away from the lack of caloric intake, but there is so much more going on than that, Jack.
Well, let's just drill down on that for 1 second, because as soon as you said that, I had horrible visions in my brain of famine, concentration camps, people being deliberately deprived of nutrition. The images from Africa during the famines from the 1980s, We Are the World kind of stuff. Clearly people were withering and dying because they didn't have enough food. I mean, that doesn't seem to me to even be a thought experiment. It seems to have been completely evidenced. I mean, ask the Ukrainians, under Stalin and whatnot. If you don't eat, you're going to die. So to what extent is that really even in a debate? Are there other mechanisms at work that may delay that withering away and dying process? I'm kind of hinting at a reduction in your energy expenditure. Maybe it'd be useful to just break down the energy expenditure sort of model and the various components of energy expenditure, and then we can dig down on that just a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, ultimately, just to answer your question, the body is very smart and it will find ways to survive no matter what, and in all sorts of dire circumstances. So even in the absence of caloric intake or adequate intake, we switch into different forms of metabolism where we start to break down our own natural fat to start with, typically, and then we move to muscle, we move to bone, even, and connective tissue. So the body will find ways ultimately to preserve itself. And energy, when we talk about calories in, calories out, ultimately we're filtering down on the mitochondria and how our bodies actually use energy in different forms. Whether you're in a ketogenic diet or your high carb diet, we still shuttle down through various pathways into molecules like acetyl CoA that then enter either into a pathway where we are using fatty acids to metabolize that, or we are putting that into what we call the citric acid cycle, which is what we typically think about that supplies our mitochondria with the necessary components in order to generate ATP. ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is the currency of energy within our bodies. Anything that we are doing, from our cellular mechanisms to our baseline breathing and heart rate to the skeletal muscle use that we have when we're sprinting or working out, all use ATP. And so understanding this balance is clearly important. I think, to say it again, however, there's not one way that we should understand the obesity epidemic in general. Certainly, an excess of calories in our modern day and age has led to much of the obesity we're seeing now. 40% of Americans are obese. Another 30% are overweight. And that number, as you mentioned earlier, is not slowing down at all. So there's an interesting study that's actually referenced in this one that we're talking about right now, where the author goes into a commentary that up till the year 2000, there was certainly an increase in the overall number of calories at a population level that were available to Americans to consume. And our personal consumption of calories continued to rise, from when we started measuring this in the 50s or whatever, up till about the year 2000. After the year 2000, there's not much evidence to suggest that the overall surplus of calories in the world, nor the personal intake of calories, has increased dramatically. Yet, we continue to see over the past 24 years now that obesity continues to rise. So there is this, discrepancy and a paradox bit there to understand and to unpack. And I think where we'll start to get into some of the other models here.
Okay. I'm going to just circle back on a couple of things and then ask you a question, which is going to ruffle some feathers for some people. One, as the energy level intake goes down and we're consuming fewer calories, the body will naturally decrease some of its typical energy expenditure. You'll be less likely to fidget, less likely to move around, have less energy to just go about your daily activities. And so if you're starving to death, your body is going to slow you down. That, I think, is pretty well understood. So I think that's one reason why, you can be in a deficit and then kind of stop losing weight for a little bit. The second thing I wanted to bring up that you just said was that when you're in a calorie deficit, you can switch into different types of energy systems to fuel your ATP production. I think I'm not the doctor here. I'm making this link.
That's correct.
That's correct. Okay, good. Phew. No wonder we've got the doctor here. But burning fat as an energy source is a secondary system within the human body, right? It's not the primary system, or it is a primary system, or it's a secondary system. Is it a backup system? This is the
I'd
part that I'm
say in
trying to
many
understand
ways,
about keto here.
yeah, I'd say in many ways it is what we consider a backup system, meaning in the presence of glucose, where, basically everything outside of fat kind of converges on this glucose pathway. In the absence of glucose, or I should say, in the presence of glucose, we will always use that typical sort of pathway to push that down through the citric acid cycle to create ATP. It's only when we are in states, whether we are choosing to do so or not, but certainly the keto movement is a good example of this, where, these folks talk about our primitive sort of digestive and food environments, which, just to take a slight detour for one moment, I think that a lot of folks talk about what food used to be like in this world and what human beings used to eat, and we should return to that. And while there may be some degree of truth to that, and we'll get to this later on, I think really that is more focused on the ultra processed foods and things like that. Because when you look back at human history, there are different kinds of tribes and different kinds of groups of people who utilized all sorts of different energy sources based on what was available to them. There were hunter gatherers. There were those that kind of were more on the gatherer side and focused more on berries and fruits and vegetables and things like that. And there were those cultures that focused more on the meats and the fats and those kinds of things. So these cultures and these phenomena developed in parallel in many ways. So in addition, there were many problems, obviously, in prehistoric times with human beings, not living to their full potential. So to say that we should eat like our ancestors did, 2,000, 5,000 years ago, I think is, maybe not hitting the entire picture here. But certainly I do, give credit to the fact that ultra processed foods, and that has certainly changed the composition of our own food. But, to your point, whenever glucose is available in abundance, that is the primary method that the body will use. It is only in the absence of that that we switch to some of these other forms of metabolism.
Two questions on this, and then we can move on. I know it's true that if you eat enough protein without eating carbs, there's a process called gluconeogenesis where your body will turn the protein into glucose inside your own body. So that tells me that we like glucose. But two, and keto advocates may take this, who knows? I've been in ketosis, deep in ketosis, and my breath was terrible. Like it was awful. Keto breath. It's a phenomenon. As human beings, we are attuned to things that smell good, things that smell bad. Rotting flesh smells bad, so we don't eat it, right? We know that like fecal matter smells bad, so we don't play with it. But when a nasty breath is coming out of your mouth, isn't that a sign that perhaps it's not the ideal human condition? Just question.
Perhaps. I think, there are other sort of reports around beta hydroxybutyrate kind of having this fruity odor in the breath as well. But I certainly have seen and heard this, keto breath kind of thing. There are all sorts of signals that should be telling us what we should eat and what we shouldn't eat. Some people, here's a controversial statement, Jack. There is no one right diet for every single person. And a sub controversial statement of that, there is no one right diet for one particular individual for their entire life. It is okay to perhaps have different eras and epochs of your own life as you're trying to optimize things and stay in a good nutritional state. Is that keto breath kind of universal? I don't know, but it is certainly a factor to consider of what are the untoward effects that we are seeing from each of these different kind of interventions.
Interesting to think about. Okay, let's move on. Let's get into that was in some the energy balance model, and I think most of us are going to understand this as calories in, calories out. In the bodybuilder community, it is virtually unassailable religious level stature about calories in, calories out being the end all be all model for gaining or losing fat. And I can see why they would say that. These guys are meticulous in tracking both energy in and energy out. They'll build a spreadsheet about their weight today, body fat percentage today, desired body fat percentage in X number of weeks, calculate the required deficit, perform that required deficit, and achieve their goal basically on the money every time without fail, so long as they stick to this model. So I can see why people are entirely focused 100% on calories in, calories out. I myself am a big calories in, calories out kind of person. However, my exploration into this subject matter has really opened up my eyes to the possibility of there being a number of other factors that will contribute to the relative amount of fat on your body. And that for me represents a major personal evolution because I too was once a calories in, calories out advocate 100%. I think one of the most obvious alternatives that people discuss are going to be contained related here in this next model that we're going to talk about called the carbohydrate insulin model, CIM, as indicated here in this study. Dr. Deep, what is the carbohydrate insulin model? How is it different from the energy balance model? And what does it tell us about nutrition and people's level of adiposity, as one might say?
Yeah, great question. And I think, the calorie in, calorie out, just to round that out, that tends to not necessarily focus on one particular food group being the thing that's causing your obesity, meaning you can eat a balanced diet, you can have different macros throughout your day as long as your calories in are less than expended, then you should be losing adipose. And at some point, you will lose other things as well. The carbohydrate insulin model is really focused on that one macro, the carbohydrates, more than anything. As we mentioned, carbohydrates are digested and get turned into glucose molecules. And the theory here is that in the presence of too much glucose in our blood, by which we don't need to use all of that in order to generate the ATP that we actually need, that those glucose molecules get stored as fat, lipogenesis. And in the presence of insulin, in the presence of high glucose vis-a-vis carbohydrate load, we do see individuals putting on weight and putting on fat, sometimes even in relative calorie deficits. Now, that's very balanced because, if you're in a 1,000-calorie deficit a day and you're eating only carbohydrates, there's actually interesting studies around this and personal anecdotes where some of these scientists have done the Twinkie diet, for example, to prove a point that that taking in less calories but focusing on high carbohydrates still led to more adipose deposition over time. So there is something to be said here. You reference kind of the bodybuilding community here, and you're probably a lot closer than that than I am. But insulin itself is anabolic, meaning it helps to produce tissue in all sorts of ways. How that is shuttled into muscle versus adipose is the key there. But for those that are, proponents of a low carb diet and low carb intake, this is really the crux of the matter. And I think those are the two really predominant models that most nutrition folks are talking about how to manage our weight in this modern world, is through calories or through a reduction of carbohydrates.
Depending on your insulin function, do you have a different reaction to carbohydrates entering into your body?
Insulin sensitivity, I think, is one of the most important things here, in that, we certainly see insulin resistance all over the place for many different reasons.
What is that? What is insulin resistance?
Insulin resistance is, even in the presence of insulin, the hormone that is meant to push glucose intracellularly in order for our that TCA cycle to start and for our mitochondria to actually transmit that into ATP. The glucose has to make it from the blood vessel into our cells. Over time, when you are exposed to almost anything in excess, your body can handle that to some degree, but at some point it says, oh man, there is too much of this floating substance around, in this case, insulin, and I need to shut down any kind of reaction to insulin. I think one thing that's not really talked about in this paper all that much, but that we and others in our space have been doing a lot of discussion on is leptin. Leptin is another hormone that is produced by our adipocytes. And the interesting thing is that the more obese you are, the more leptin you are producing, and leptin should theoretically reduce your appetite. The reason that doesn't happen, though, is because the receptors, the leptin receptors, start to downregulate because there's so much of this hitting these cells at all times. Same thing with insulin. There's a lot of reasons for insulin resistance, things from sleep deprivation to, high insulin state just from too many carbohydrates and sweets. Skeletal muscle mass tends to improve insulin resistance or to promote insulin sensitivity. Cardiovascular exercise, aerobic exercise tends to improve insulin sensitivity. And so we're really talking about, even if you have the right kind of hormones floating around, are those falling on deaf ears, or are they actually being used by the body in a correct way?
I think that it's this insulin sensitivity, resistance, and your body's reaction to that in terms of fat gain that really began to open my eyes to alternative models of explaining adiposity. I don't know that I'll ever get used to saying that word as a layperson. Increased fatness on my body.
Yep.
As a year ago, I was highly insulin resistant and I wasn't able to use carbohydrates in an effective manner, partly because my muscle mass wasn't as good as it could have been. My cardiovascular exercise wasn't as good as it could have been. My sleep was dysregulated. And so, like, all of these factors lead up to the fact that I'm eating carbohydrates and it's just basically going straight to fat and or like clogging my arteries, I think. Right. And so, am I right about that? Let's not let that one slip
Yes.
if I'm wrong. Okay. And clogging
Nope.
my arteries at the same time, too. And once I got down to a certain level of body fat and had all of my exercise and everything all dialed in, and insulin resistance turned insulin sensitivity, my body reacted to carbohydrates in a much different fashion. And in fact, you could just feel the pump in your muscles as you use carbohydrates in conjunction with resistance training, and watching myself increase caloric intake but still maintain a level of body fat was really mind-boggling to me. And I'm beginning to think, oh my God, maybe there are hormonal reasons for obesity that I had not already considered in the past.
Yeah, there are, we call this metabolic adaptation or adaptability, in that how likely are you as an individual to respond well to these different kinds of nutritional intake in your body. And, again, that's why I said earlier that even for an individual just like you, Jack, that was on more of a ketogenic diet, and maybe that was the right thing to kind of reset your system at that time in order for your insulin sensitivity to improve, because now you're not getting slammed with insulin all day constantly from all the carbohydrate and sugar intake. Now you've let your cells kind of relax a bit, and you've downregulated some of those receptors. You're much more sensitive to this hormone now, and there's a different period of life now that you're reset, you can now eat carbohydrates in a manageable kind of way and not blow up or not become into a hyperinsulin kind of state. I think a lot of doctors, a lot of medical practices are still very nascent in this model, Jack, even though it is one of the most predominant ways of understanding. Most practices check what we call a hemoglobin A1C once every 3 months, if you're lucky. That is really a late stage finding. This is after you've had high levels of glucose circulating in your blood. We call it glycosylation. The glucose molecules start to attach to red blood cells, and that's what we're actually measuring with our hemoglobin A1C, which is a great test for kind of looking at 3 months of prior sort of intake of glucose and sugar and carbohydrates. but it is, again, a late stage finding. The things that you really should be looking at are things like fasting insulin levels. Are you already showing, even in the absence of this glycosylation, that your insulin levels are ramped up and revved up? If that's the case, you may be heading there sooner than we think. Similarly, there's something called the LPIR score, the lipoprotein insulin resistance score. And out of every measure that we have, this is actually the one that is most highly correlated with the downstream development of diabetes. And rarely do I see that checked. We check both those things on all our patients because it is so important that even if your hemoglobin A1C is normal, it doesn't necessarily mean that your body is handling the glucose load and the carbohydrate load as you should. So it is important to understand some of these biomarkers to give yourself a sense of where you are along that continuum.
It's a very good advertisement for Rebel Health. Most of your doctors aren't going to even know what these scores are, much less check them, much less know how to interpret them, much less understand how to use them to shepherd you through various stages of your diet life. I think the best advice most doctors are going to give you is you should be eating better, eat better, sleep more, move more. It's this level of insight that's really going to give you the best outcomes and also alleviate stress, food stress. Like, do I have to adhere to this particular diet for the rest of my life? Is this something that's sustainable? Well, what if it is in short doses? As you mentioned, for me, low carb helped me solve my insulin resistance. It helped me reduce my metabolic, conditions that I had. And now that it's been solved and I feel great, I'm eating carbs and I feel great. So it's not like something you have to do forever, although there are a number of nutrition and health groups out there that will tell you keto for life, carnivore for life, etc. But that's not what this podcast is about today. So do you think we've covered the CIM, or the carbohydrate insulin model, sufficiently well here, or is there any other things you'd like to add to it?
I think we've covered this sufficiently, and this is those two again, the calorie in, calorie out model and the carbohydrate insulin model are really the two predominant ones that most nutrition experts are talking about.
Right. All right. Now let's get on to something that I had never even heard of before I had read this report, or I guess it's not a study, but it's just basically a paper trying to present a theory here. The next model for explaining obesity that they discuss is the energy reduction oxidation model, or redox. Doc, talk to me like I know nothing about this, because I certainly don't, and I doubt most of our listeners do. So explain to us what this energy reduction oxidation model is and what it means.
Sure, and this is complex, so follow along as best you can. And this is really a biochemical thing. Every med student has nightmares of memorizing these pathways as we're trained. There's something called reactive oxygen species, ROS, and you'll see that reference throughout this paper. These reactive oxygen species can be helpful. I mean, they are used in many different kinds of signaling pathways in the body. It's used in our immune defense. Something called superoxide dismutase is used in what we call a oxidative burst when we have an infection, and that can help kill these organisms that have infected us. But if you look at the figure 2 here that you have pulled up, the reactive oxygen species are a type of molecule that has many effects and impacts in the body. Some of them are very positive. It is used to fight off infection. It's used in different signaling pathways. As you can see here in the figure, we talked a little bit about how glucose is used from the blood system, pushed into the intracellular space, and then it enters into a series of reactions that ultimately are meant to produce ATP. The energy redox model is really talking about what happens when these reactive oxygen species are in excess in our blood system. What we found with that is that these ROS can impact our satiety signals. They can impact our insulin sensitivity. They can disrupt mitochondria and not allow us to actually produce the ATP that we actually need to, and thereby shunting much of the glucose that we've produced back into lipogenesis, into developing fat and into storing fat. So this model is pretty complex and biochemical in many ways, but it does talk through some of the deep sort of cellular reasons why we may be facing the obesity epidemic as well. We'll talk later about how this really probably is related more to the obesogens in our environment as well, and how these two models really play into one another.
Okay. Let me see if I understand this. There is some level of disruption to this ROS production and removal that impacts the glucose and how it returns, it sends it back into the bloodstream. Is that right? It's basically just like a mitochondria disruptor.
It is a mitochondrial disruptor, and let me read a line from the study here. ROS production to excess glucose can lead to beta cells' increased release of insulin, promoting energy storage. Adipocytes store triglycerides. Hepatocytes stop gluconeogenesis, and there's a decrease in neuronal signaling of satiety. So how this actually works is extremely complicated, and these ROS are in every different pathway throughout our body. But, as we're shunting things back into adipose, as we're telling our brains we are no longer full, often that is coming from these ROS, these reactive oxygen species. So one major driver of that is baseline inflammation. And, people talk about inflammation, and we've talked about visceral fat in the past and how that promotes inflammation. But this is really the biochemical pathway by which inflammation can actually cause more adipose in the body, not just leading to atherosclerosis, but all the other metabolic impacts that come with that, and the deposition of more subcutaneous and visceral fat.
And the plot thickens. So it's not just energy in, energy out. It may not just be your reaction to carbohydrates and insulin, but also your generalized inflammation that can come from what? Things that you eat, excess visceral fat, poor sleep, bad lighting, stress, being sick. What else raises your inflammation?
I think you hit a bunch of them. I mean, there are some studies that show increased red meat intake and certain types of ultra processed foods increase inflammation. But the things that people don't think about enough are kind of stress and sleep and disruption in circadian rhythms. And once you've gotten obese enough where you have 3, 4, 5 pounds of visceral fat, studies will all show that that is one of the major drivers of baseline inflammation in our body that is promoting more of these reactive oxygen species, leading to all of those downstream effects that I mentioned.
Well, I can personally attest to lowering my inflammation and decreasing my excess fatness, as by decreasing my visceral fat, increasing my time of sleep, increasing my exercise, increasing my sunlight intake, decreasing of stress. I think this is why people talk about meditation and journaling and other ways of reducing stress as well. And so the model appears to be getting richer and telling me more and more that it's not simply a matter of energy in, energy out, even though that does seem to be the foundation of it all. There are these other nuances. And now I think we're going to move on to the next of the four here, which is the obesogen model. And obesogenic is a word that I have learned in the last year, meaning the environment that we live in is creating obesity. Obesogenic. uh, Salutogenic is what we want. We want an environment that's going to be increasing your health, but it appears that we're living in an obesogenic environment. And I think this concept that we're going to dig into here, just on a very broad level, makes some sense to me, because when I think about the collective group level increase in, I can't say adiposity with a straight face, so the increased group level of obesity and fatness in America, if it were simply a matter of willpower, then I think the implied statement here is that something in the collective American conscious changed to reduce our executive ability and to make us less likely to be able to implement the decision making that we know is favorable or healthy for us. I don't buy that. I don't buy that America and a lot of other countries all at the same time collectively have lost their will to execute things that are good for them in their lives. So, if there's something in the environment that's affecting all of us, well, now that's something for us to take a look at. Dr. Deep, explain to us folks here who are not physicians and not part of the Obesity Society of America or whatever, that what the obesogen model is in this context, shortened to OBS.
Sure, Jack. The obesogen model is what we hear when we think about the environment is killing us and the environment is poisoning us. We have these, obesogens like BPA and phthalates and PFAS, even fructose. You've got the slide up here, red colorings, yellow colorings. We're just now starting to understand the very intricate sort of impact that these chemicals have on our body. And the authors here make a statement, and I agree, that obesity in large part is a neuroendocrine disorder and a neurohormonal disorder, meaning as we consume different kinds of foods, ultra processed foods, as we are in contact with these BPAs and the plastics and every single thing that we touch and eat, is that disrupting our hormonal signals around satiety and around our choices and decisions? And you mentioned like this collective worldwide executive functioning that seemed to just kind of go away during this epidemic. And I agree, it's unlikely that all of a sudden we are all kind of subject to the same mass psychosis, but at the same time, I do think that the rise of these different chemicals and compounds in our environment have certainly tracked, interestingly, with the obesity epidemic as well. Another comment I'll make is when we talk about ultra processed foods, I think that's in this sort of category of obesogens, and it's all these dyes and all these preservatives and everything that we have listed here. And these are things that are highly, highly studied and regulated by food industry and the FDA and others to understand what it does to us. Whether or not that's public knowledge or it's published in academic papers is yet to be known. But we know that, the Nabiscos and the Pepsis and the Krafts of the world, they are targeting hormonal neurological processes in our body. They are hijacking our dopamine and serotonin systems to hit those kinds of receptors with the ingestion of these kinds of foods so that we drive more purchasing of those foods. And while that might be good for business, I think we've clearly seen what that's doing at a population level here.
I think it's interesting to point out that, look, anybody with half a brain can figure out that a bag of Funyuns or a 2 liter of Mountain Dew isn't going to be good for you in the long run and consumed in excess. But what's interesting to read into this study here about obesogens, they're talking about prescription drugs, insecticides, plastics, household chemicals, food components like fructose, trans fats, preservatives, etc. They could include solvents. They can include things like DDT, nonstick coatings, parts of your clothing and furniture protectorates, food preservatives, personal care products, air pollutants. Even some pharmaceutical drugs and early life antibiotics can be obesogens, according to this study, and exposure can occur via air, water, food, skin contact, or dust inhalation. So effectively, we could all just be breathing in things that are disrupting our hormone signaling pathways. Listen to me, try to sound like a doctor, to the extent that we end up becoming all fat. And I think that I read, as I was clicking through some of the reference studies in here, that even livestock in certain areas were found to be getting fatter, just still on the same amount of feed. Like, the farmer isn't going out and buying 30% more feed and feeding it to his
Right.
animals. If anything, they know exactly how much feed they're giving them, right? It's part of their economic model. And the animals were just getting fatter. Or your domestic house pets just getting fatter. Like, there could literally be something in the air, an airborne pathogen spreading among the population, leading to obesity and all the terrible, horrible downstream effects of obesity and metabolic disruption that populate the top 10 list of reasons why people die in America.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Jack. It's
Should we be terrified by this?
frankly, yes, I think. I mean, we have
Yeah.
an all-out onslaught into, our lives, and you just mentioned a lot of these great examples. It's a little bit disheartening, right? Like, how do you escape that, and how do you really get away from that? I think, if we're going to talk about sort of primitive diets and things like that, to me, and what the authors are kind of saying here, is that obesogens, through the obesogen model, through what we'll talk about next, where it connects with the redox model and then ultimately unifies all four of these models, seem to be one of the primary drivers of the obesity epidemic. When we look at the data and try to understand, when you the thing about, the calorie in, calorie out, or the CIM model, is we all know people who have lost weight or gained weight by reducing their calories or going up on their calories. We all know people who have lost weight or gained weight by reducing their carbs or going up on their carbs, right? But we are all kind of subject to these obesogens in our environment. And, returning to a time when we use glass, when we are preserving things in our own sort of local environments, where plastic isn't everywhere, where we're making things out of cotton and wool, and where the air is cleaner or not. I mean, there's a million things every single day. Even some of the bros on Twitter, the orthorexic folks, are talking about receipts and like not wanting to touch receipts. And there's some truth to that. There are these chemicals in this. I think, they're probably missing the forest for the trees in those kind of arguments, in my opinion. But still, there is almost no escape in many ways. And there's all sorts of real world, empiric evidence around this. When we look at third world countries that import a Western type diet, which could be all sorts of different food groups, the primary thing we sort of see is obesity kind of catches up with where America is. And it begs the question, is it all of these different kind of environmental exposures that are somehow fundamentally disrupting this entire neurohormonal axis? And I think yes is the answer, at least in part leading to the obesity crisis that we're seeing today.
America exporting fatness to the rest of the world through our manufactured products, chemicals, etc. Also, our pop culture, our fast food systems, processed foods. What an amazing legacy America is having. The study says, quote, while exposure is ubiquitous, the effects of obesogens vary depending on genetic susceptibility. Interesting to note that all of these obesogens are going to affect different genetic makeups differently, including different racial makeups, it says. Age, sex, home and work location, personal habits, and diet. So they leave the door open here for being able to overcome the ubiquitous nature of these obesogenic elements in our environment. And I think you have to say that because it's obvious to all of us that there are some people who can lose weight and keep it off, and there are some people who can gain weight when they want it and lose weight when they want. And it seems like what's the unifying like common denominator of people that lose weight is like a will to do it. And yet in some people it's reported, I don't know how accurately, that even some of those people with the will and putting forth the work are actually not having the same results. I don't know about that. I haven't studied that element, but I do know that of all the people that I know who live in the same environment that I do, who consume many of the same substances, breathe the same air, drink the same water, et cetera, you make some changes in your life, you move some more, you eat better, you get rid of some of these crappy foods, you exercise, you lift weights, you sleep better, you reduce the stress, you reduce your inflammation, and you can have good results. So it's not a death sentence, but it would explain how, if you are just drifting along the current of life, you could have your entire endocrine, hormonal, neurotransmitter, I believe we said, uh, systems completely hijacked, and you're just subconsciously being driven towards these behaviors that are not healthy, and they're going to lead to you getting fat. This is astonishing, kind of terrifying, but it makes sense. And especially when you look at like regional distributions of obesity, people will overlay on top of that usage of certain pesticides, or the usage of certain pesticides and watersheds and the geographic concentration. So all of this has led me to really open up my heart, actually, to people who are suffering from obesity. It is not simply just a matter of calories in, calories out. It's not simply just a matter of carbohydrate intake. There are other things happening, some of which, maybe many of which, maybe all of which are kind of outside of our control. And to me, that would be a better explanation for the group level rise, rather than a sudden loss of willpower, or a sudden lack of interest in being healthy, or a sudden lack of interest in aesthetics, or all things good and beautiful. So let's continue on, because I think, as had been presented previously, these models were somewhat mutually exclusive. And the goal of this paper was to present a proposed integrated model. And let's talk about that, because I think that once we begin to give credence to each one of these and see how they all pile up on top of each other, we may get closer to a solution.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think well said, previously around, it's not just one of these things, right? It's obviously all of them kind of playing into each other. And again, as I said earlier, it's just too reductionist to believe that if we just cut out bread for the rest of our lives, the entire population is going to be much healthier. There's so much more going on. There's plenty of data everywhere to suggest that. But also, to your point, in a positive way, it is not deterministic either, right? Even though we are suffering this all out onslaught in obesogens and environmental factors that may be impacting us, there are fit, healthy people all around who drink out of their Stanley cup or their plastic things and sleep in polyester stuff all day long, and they are the model of health. But there could be underlying cellular mechanisms that are still going on in some of these people that we should sort of understand. So to bring together the last two sort of models, the obesogens in our environment, as well as the redox model, the authors here, propose this OBS redox model, in which they are quite related. As we intake these obesogens, it may have disruptive nature on our neurohormonal axis, but it is often leading to more of these reactive oxygen species. And perhaps that is the thing that these environmental factors are all kind of converging upon. And it causes this baseline inflammation in our body as well. And so there is a real connection between these two kinds of things. What causes all of the reactive oxygen species in the redox model to be something that we know of in science is the real question. And I think the authors are positing here that it's most likely the obesogens in our environment. They make a comment here about, the changes, the obesity-related changes that are predicted by this obesogen redox model. Increased insulin secretion, adipocyte differentiation, altered adipocyte size and number, inflammation, increased lipids, increase in non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, an altered microbiome, which we didn't really talk about, insulin and leptin resistance, increased food intake, altered resting metabolic rate, and reduced voluntary energy expenditure. So you think about those things and start to realize that these mechanisms through the environmental things, and maybe there's some sinister plot to make us all fat and lazy and stupid, who knows, but more likely all of these organizations were doing what served their sort of bottom line, and packaging in plastic and making something shelf stable allowed their business to thrive, and we didn't actually understand how that was impacting downstream health. But now with this sort of proposed model, we can start to see that again, that baseline inflammation, the increase in reactive oxygen species, is probably the thing that is causing all of these downstream untoward effects that lead to obesity and so many other metabolic conditions.
That list that you read was astonishing. It really does tie together each of the various models. I mean, all the way down to decreased voluntary energy expenditure. So if you take the outside external obesogenic factors, you insert them into your body, and then you get all of these disruptions that we have talked about, even disrupting your energy expenditure levels, messing with your gut biome. And we didn't even talk about like caloric absorption in the gut. And I have some questions about that. It's really, it makes me feel, on one hand, it makes me feel a little guilty for being so judgy about obese people in the past, to be totally honest. And I'm going to have to share some of this with my kids, because I've always hammered home the fact that you don't want to be fat, right? Like, don't be fat. And there's good reason for that, obviously. But the cause of it is something that is so complex that it's astonishing that we don't really know for sure. Like, gee, why is everybody fat? Like, seems like such a basic question, but when you dig down into it, there is so much going on. And when we start thinking about the fact that these external circumstances are affecting our liver, our fat cell production, our brain function, our pancreatic function, it almost seems, does it seem hopeless? And I ask that because what it tells, and I'll give you 1 second, what it tells me is that instead of just being healthy by the nature of your daily life, as a byproduct of your daily life, you have to make being healthy the focus of your life, so that your rest of the remaining elements of your life can be productive and useful. And it seems to have elevated the level of concern and attention and focus you have to put on maintaining healthy weight levels for all the reasons we've discussed. Because if you don't do that, you're going to get sick, and you're going to become a burden on the people that you love, and you're going to have a diminished quality of life. So it's no longer a byproduct of living a good life to be healthy. You have to be healthy in order to live a good life. And that is a real paradigm shift that I don't know we're ready for.
Yeah, I think you said that well, Jack. And many folks think about weight loss or getting healthy or focusing on their health as a chore, right? As something that they have to do, something they have to sacrifice, something they have to suffer through. And as you mentioned, the people I see that really thrive in this have made this the primary focus of their lives. And maybe we're biased, but to me, what more important thing is there to focus on in your life rather than feeling healthy and well and promoting your own longevity and being there for your family as long as you can? It definitely takes diligence every day. Now, again, don't get me wrong. Like I don't think, having a processed cracker, shelf-stable, whatever, once a week or something, or a couple times a month is going to be the thing that causes you to be obese or to be metabolically unhealthy. I think the problem is that people are predominantly consuming these highly ultra processed foods. They're predominantly living in environments that are completely manufactured, that are sort of exposing them to all these different kinds of chemicals. They're predominantly living in caloric excess. They're predominantly living in a state of hyperinsulinemia. And of course, all of those things, if you are doing 90% of the time instead of the 10% of the time, you're certainly going to see the negative effects of that. But again, I don't want to be nihilistic in this either, in that there really is a way for us to understand these different models in concert together and to practically apply that into our lives. If you've got the figure pulled up here, which I was going to go to, and the authors kind of finish off by saying, actually we can marry all four of these different models together when we think about this in the right way. Our diet, the obesogens that we're sort of exposed to, and this starts literally in utero. There's studies that show that the preterm weight of the mother is one of the most predictive factors in the lifetime obesity risk of the infant. Now, that's crazy, right? Like, something is happening epigenetically, and that's what we talk about. That's why you have an epigenetic coach. And I think people don't really understand what that term means, but we have all of these genes in our body, and they can be turned on and off based on different stimuli that come in. If you want to learn more about that, you should go watch our video on our DNA and the testing that we do, and some of the deep dive there. But there really are mechanisms that are happening in utero and early on. So clearly there's an impact from the kinds of food that we're eating on our own bodies and even in our offspring. Once we've sort of consumed that, what happens? Well, we may be stimulating all of these reactive oxygen species, which are then interfering with that hormonal signaling, that your brain's not being told that I'm full, or those that leptin is falling on deaf leptin receptors because they've just been slammed for so long, and you keep eating and you keep feeling hungry, and just kind of perpetuate this cycle. So once that sort of happens, it is much more likely that you will be in caloric excess because you are continuing to eat. You're satiety, you're not feeling full there, and it's likely that you're causing things like insulin resistance, whereby even if you are eating carbohydrates, it's not being shunted into your cells in the right way to be used as energy. It's being stored as fat for a time when there may not be enough energy around. That's really kind of the body's mechanism in famine to ensure that we can survive later on. So I think they do a nice job in this figure, as you can see, of kind of marrying all four of these things and helping us understand it's not any one of them. It is very likely all of these things. One last thing I'll sort of comment on. I think they missed one big one around sort of our light and our circadian rhythms and our light environment. And there's a lot more discussion and science and everything coming out about this. And ultimately, a lot of those disruptions in circadian rhythms still kind of converge on these same things, likely through the stimulation of reactive oxygen species, but certainly through the alteration of our neurohormonal axis.
Specifically in the leptin, right?
Specifically in the leptin and the insulin resistance. Leptin, it goes up to our hypothalamus and stimulates a few different kinds of molecules, POMC, and that's cleaved into several different downstream molecules that have big effect on us. Neuropeptide Y tells us that we are full and that we should be not eating anymore. And, we can go on a deep dive into leptin and light in a separate podcast, perhaps, and show some diagrams that kind of show this. But regardless, I still think, the neurohormonal axis that is disrupted through circadian rhythm disruption likely falls into this model in many ways once you kind of get past that first step.
I think the circadian disruption in your light environment could squarely go in that obesogen category, because it's also
Very
sort
true.
of your lifestyle having this impact on you. And it's kind of overwhelming to think about the fact that so many components of your life could be the culprit to your increased adiposity, if you will. And looking at this model, it's at once kind of daunting, but I know that there are certain ways to sort of like hack this. And I think that the keto guys have figured out a way to kind of hack it. If you're not going to introduce any carbohydrates, well, then you're solving for the carbohydrate insulin model element of it and working on your insulin resistance and whatnot. But it's sort of it's not the comprehensive resolution to this problem. It's a way to hack one of the major components. And if you have the executive capacity to really specifically only consume X amount of calories and increase your caloric expenditure, even battling the involuntary reduction of energy expenditure that is associated with decreased caloric consumption and the effects of these obesogens, then you can clearly, beat this system. But if you're not doing something, if you are just flowing down the river of life, you are being bombarded at every turn with either signaling or consumption products or lack of energy expenditure or terrible lighting situations, bad sleeping environments. And all of these things are adding up to an ease of weight gain. And so when you hear all of the warring tribes out there about carbs this, calories in, calories out that, or light, or whatever the people are arguing about, they're all partially correct,
Right.
but it's
Yeah,
not
they're all partially correct and they're all partially wrong too.
yeah,
Like if
yeah,
you are on a keto diet and you're eating 4,000 calories a day and you're expending 1,800, you will gain weight. Like there's no study that's ever shown that being in a very high caloric excess, despite the intake of a particular type of food or the, exclusion of another type of food, is going to lead to weight loss. You can't just eat sticks of butter and bacon all day and expect to lose weight or lose fat. Similarly, if you're trying to put weight on, just focusing on protein and getting enough protein, but you're only getting in 1,500 calories and you're expending 2,500 a day, you're not going to put on weight. You're not going to put on muscle because your body doesn't have the necessary substrate to sort of produce that kind of tissue. So, I think while it is daunting, while it can be confusing, there's also a relatively easy recipe if you sort of look at this model here. That's still the figure here that kind of unifies it all, where perhaps reducing your caloric intake a bit, reducing your overall insulin levels by way of reduction of carbohydrates to a small degree, reducing your exposure to obesogens, reducing your inflammation, thereby reducing reactive oxygen species, improving your light and circadian rhythms, you're going to do well. You will start to lose weight. You will start to see positive impact. It's just, I think in our modern day, Jack, we are all like, we want the magic bullet and we want it now. And so we focus on the one thing that our minds and bodies can wrap our heads around, that we've convinced ourselves is the right way. And then oftentimes people don't stick with things long enough to actually see the impact of, this kind of reduction every day. A pound of fat at 3,500 calories, if you're in a 500 calorie deficit every day, which is a significant amount for most people, that's cutting out a fourth of your typical calories, you're going to lose a pound a week. And that might not even be apparent to you in your waist size or how you're looking in your face or your belly or anything for months and months, because you're losing fat from these different kinds of places. So I do think we also have a problem in sort of just attention and a desire to simplify the complex world around us, which can be helpful for heuristics sometimes, but ultimately, like we mentioned earlier, human beings are the most complex organism in the entire universe that we know, and probably the most complex system is the interaction between human beings and our food environment and built environment in many ways.
indeed. If you're leptin and satiety, is that how you say the word? your hunger
Satiety.
satiety, your hunger signaling pathways are disrupted, and you don't know when to stop eating. If you're just eating steak and butter and cheese all day, you're still going to get fat. I think that's part of what my issue has been. I tried like straight up keto in the past, and I gained weight because like I just went buck there. I'm like, okay, I'll just eat until I'm full. Turns out if I eat until I'm full, I'll eat 3 ribeyes a day, and that's going to put me in a caloric surplus. So I think on one hand, it's a little bit daunting. On another hand, I think what it does here is lay out for us a roadmap that most people can follow with a little bit of diligence and get the desired outcome on an individual basis with the proper coaching and guidance, for sure. The scary part of it is that what 99% of America isn't going to get the proper guidance and coaching and support and follow up in order to make these comprehensive changes that pull all of the levers as represented by this unifying theory for the global rise in obesity. It's okay to need help for this, guys. And if you don't make it a priority in your life, it will have downstream effects that will degrade every element of your life. It will turn you into a burden on the people that you love. It'll make it harder for you to make money. It'll make it harder for you to move around. You will lose quality years of life. You might die early, and you're not going to feel good because truly, we all know nobody likes to live a lifestyle like this. So, the moral of the story here is that obesity on a population level is extraordinarily complex. This isn't even the end all be all. There could be one obesogen that we could point to one day that we could eradicate from the environment and change all of this. Who knows? But for individuals, seek out and find help. Seek out and find help and make it a priority in your life. Otherwise, it's going to disrupt the rest of your life in a way that you will find unacceptable for sure. Dr. Deep, I think this has been one of our most informative and useful deep dives on these podcasts that we've done yet. Thank you so very much for your time and energy here, sir. Guys watching and listening, please hit subscribe. Please share this one. Please watch this video right here to dig deeper into other topics we've talked about, like the health gangsters and how they're taking over the country and the general state of sickness in America. I am Jack Murphy, co-founder of Rebel Health Alliance and the co-host of this podcast. Dr. Deep, thank you very much, guys. Hit subscribe, share, and we are out.